Hi, friends. We're dying to know which cities you're listening to us from, so hurry up, give us a like, and write in the comments where you're from. And also share what shocking stories have happened in your city, or maybe even with you personally. Subscribe, because the next story might just be about your area, or even your own personal drama. Subscribe so you don't miss out. And now, let's dive into a new exciting story. Louise Harper pushed open the glass door of her suburban Atlanta home, her heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floor of the hallway. Her laptop bag weighed down on her shoulder, and in her hands she clutched a bag of Thai food pad Thai noodles and spring rolls she had picked up along the way. It was almost 9 in the evening, and dusk had already deepened outside the window, coloring the street in the soft tones of the lanterns. She was tired not just physically, but in the way you get tired when you spend the whole day holding your face in front of people who smile in your eyes and sharpen knives behind your back. "Calvin, I'm home," she shouted, kicking off her shoes at the threshold. Her voice echoed throughout the house, but there was no answer. Only the slight hum of the TV from the living room suggested that her husband was somewhere nearby. She walked through the kitchen, dropped the bag on the dark granite countertop, and reached into the cabinet for the plates. The smell of spices from the food had already begun to tease her empty stomach in the office. She only had time to drink coffee and eat half of yesterday's sandwich. The day turned out to be hellish. A presentation for a client, endless edits from James, her boss, and also this strange silence in the open space when she left his office. Her colleagues looked at her as if she had just won the lottery, or conversely, had stolen someone else's winnings. "Calvin, where are you?" She called again, a little louder. This time a rustling sound came from the living room, and a second later her husband appeared in the doorway. Calvin Harper was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that he usually combed back, but now it was disheveled, as if he had been rubbing his head with his hands all evening. He was wearing an old Georgia Tech t-shirt, a throwback from his college days, and faded jeans. He was holding a bottle of Bud Light in his hand, and judging by the way he was squeezing it, it wasn't the first of the evening. "Well, finally," he said, leaning against the doorframe. The voice was even, but there was a certain heaviness in it, like that of a man who had been waiting for a long time and was already tired of waiting. "I thought you decided to stay in the office for the night." Louise rolled her eyes but smiled. She was used to his teasing Calvin liked to dramatize her late returns, although it usually ended in laughter and a kiss. Today, however, there was something else in his tone, something spicy. "Very funny," she replied, taking out the plates. "We had a presentation for Delta. James made me redo the slides 3 times until he got it perfect. I almost died of hunger, so let's eat before the food gets cold." Calvin walked over to the table, put the bottle down, and crossed his arms over his chest. His gaze slid over her from her disheveled blonde hair to the black jacket that she had not yet taken off. Louise was beautiful, even after 12 hours of work. High cheekbones, big green eyes, and a figure that she maintained by doing yoga in the morning. But now he looked at her not with his usual admiration, but with something else. With suspicion she couldn't understand yet. "It's a presentation, then," he drawled, sitting down at the table. "And how many James were there in this presentation?" Louise froze with a spoon in her hand, which she was using to spread the noodles. She looked up at her husband, trying to discern whether he was joking or not. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "James is my boss, Kel. He always gets into things like this. You know how he likes to control everything down to the last comma." "Yeah, I know," Calvin nodded, taking a sip of beer. "The whole office seems to know what you're doing there, too." Her hand shook, and some of the sauce dripped onto the table. She put down the spoon and wiped the stain with a napkin, feeling irritation begin to boil inside her. This wasn't the first time Calvin had made such remarks, but they usually sounded like jokes. There was some subtext in his words today, and she didn't like it. "Okay, what does this even mean?" she asked, sitting down opposite. "You're kind of strange today." "Did something happen?" Calvin shrugged, but his eyes never left her. They were dark brown, almost black in the dim light of the kitchen lamp, and there was something in them that she couldn't make out. "Nothing happened," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm just curious how everything works in your office. You're with James behind closed doors all day, and then you come home at 9. People say all sorts of things." "People talking?" she asked, and her voice became a little higher in surprise. "What kind of people, Calvin? Are you now collecting gossip from my colleagues?" "Not with your colleagues," he snapped. "With my friends. With Brian, for example. He told me a couple of interesting things over beer today." Louise frowned. Brian was an old friend of Calvin's from college days, a loud, red-haired guy who worked in a car repair shop and liked to make mountains out of molehills. She had never taken him seriously, but now her patience was beginning to crack. "And what did Brian tell you?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Come on, lay it out. I want to know what nonsense you're listening to." Calvin chuckled, but it wasn't the warm smile she was used to. It was a cold, almost sarcastic laugh. "He said he heard from someone who works in your building that you and James, well, let's just say, work very closely together," he said, pausing to watch her reaction. "That you are almost a couple in front of everyone." Louise opened her mouth, but the words got stuck somewhere in her throat. She looked at her husband, trying to understand whether he was serious when he said this. Her heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from growing anger. She knew the office was full of gossip. Emily and Sarah, those two snakes, were always whispering at the coffee machine, but for it to get back to Calvin, through some Brian. "You're kidding, right?" she finally squeezed out. "Do you really believe this nonsense?" "I didn't say I believe," he replied, raising his hands as if in defense. "I'm just retelling what I heard. But just think about it, Lou. You stay late every evening. James calls you on the weekend. You laugh with him like old friends. People notice. People notice because they have nothing to do," she almost shouted, getting up from the table. Her plate remained untouched, and the smell of food, which until recently seemed so appetizing, was now annoying. "Do you even understand what it sounds like? You're accusing me of something based on rumors from some Brian who doesn't even know where I work." "I don't blame you," Calvin said, but his tone became harsher. "I'm asking. These are different things." "No, it's the same thing," she snapped. "You sit here, drink beer, and listen to gossip instead of asking me directly. You are my husband, Calvin. You have to trust me." He looked at her for a long time, and at that moment she felt a wall grow between them. Invisible, but tangible. He opened his mouth to say something, but then changed his mind and simply took another sip of beer. "I trust," he finally said, but his voice sounded unconvincing. I don't know. Sometimes it seems that you live more there, in your office, than here, with me." Louise clenched her fists, feeling her nails dig into her palms. She wanted to scream, to throw something at him, but she restrained herself. Instead, she took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to regain control. "I'm working, Kel," she said, trying to speak calmly. "I'm working so we can pay off the mortgage on this house. So we can go on the vacation you dream of. And you sit here and listen to all sorts of garbage from people who don't even know us." Calvin looked away, staring at the bottle. Silence hung between them, heavy as a thundercloud. Finally, he nodded, but said nothing. Louise looked at him for another second, then turned around and walked towards the stairs. "I'll take a shower," she said over her shoulder. "Eat if you want. I'm not hungry anymore." She went upstairs, feeling how every step echoed in her head. In the bedroom, she closed the door and leaned her back against it, closing her eyes. Her heart was still pounding, and Calvin's words were ringing in her ears. "The whole office seems to know." She knew there were rumors in the office, she wasn't blind. But for it to reach home, before her marriage. She threw her jacket on the bed and looked at her reflection in the mirror. A tired woman with disheveled hair and dark circles under her eyes. It was her, Louise Harper, a middle manager just trying to do her job. And now her own husband looked at her as if she were a stranger. Downstairs, the refrigerator door slammed. Calvin must have gotten another beer. Louise sighed and went to the bathroom. The hot water should have washed away the day, but she knew her husband's words would stay with her for a long time. 7 years ago, Louise stood by the open trunk of an old Ford Escape, trying to stuff a box of books into it, which clearly didn't want to fit. The sun was blazing mercilessly. July in Georgia was like an oven, and sweat ran down her back, soaking her white t-shirt. She was 25, and she wore her hair long, down to her shoulders, and it kept getting into her eyes as she puffed and puffed over that stupid box. It was their first move from a cramped rented apartment in the center of Atlanta to a small house in the suburbs, which they bought with a loan. "Our first step towards the American dream," Calvin joked, and she laughed, although inside she still didn't believe it was true. "Lou, leave it alone, I'll throw it in myself," said Calvin's voice behind her. She turned around and saw him, wearing khaki shorts and a Georgia Tech t-shirt, holding 2 cold bottles of Sweetwater IPA. He was tanned, with light stubble, and smiled that wide, boyish smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "I can handle it," she answered stubbornly, pushing the box again. It moved a couple of inches, but immediately got stuck, resting against the corner of the suitcase. Louise exhaled and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "If you're so strong, you could help instead of standing here with beer." Calvin laughed, put the bottles on the grass, and walked over to her. He grabbed her waist from behind, pulled her towards him, and kissed her neck briefly, but so that goosebumps ran across her skin, despite the heat. "You're too stubborn for your own good," he said, taking the box from her hands. In one motion, he threw it into the trunk, as if it were not a stack of books, but a pillow. "Here, see? Everything is simple when an engineer gets down to business." "Oh, what a hero," she snorted, but couldn't help but smile. She took one of the bottles, took a cool sip, and looked at him. "Do you even realize that we are homeowners now? It's official. We are adults." Calvin leaned against the car next to her, looking at their new house across the street. It was a modest 1-story cottage with white siding and a small porch, which already had a couple of folding chairs bought at a crossroads at Walmart. The lawn was a little overgrown, and the paint on the shutters was peeling, but to them it was a palace. "Adults, you say?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "Then why do I still want to get a dog and ride my bike around the neighborhood like a kid?" "Because you'll never grow up," she replied, jabbing him in the side with her elbow. "But that's why I love you." He turned to her, and something warm, almost tender, flashed in his dark eyes. He leaned down and kissed her slowly, deeply, so that she felt the taste of hops on his lips. When he pulled away, he said quietly, "I love you too, Lou, and this house is just the beginning. You and I will do more of this." She nodded, feeling a warmth spreading inside her, not from the heat, but from his words. They met 2 years ago at a party with mutual friends. Louise had just started her first job as an assistant manager at a small marketing firm, and Calvin was finishing his master's degree in engineering. He was a loud, confident guy who knew how to make a crowd laugh, but at the same time looked at them as if they were the only one in the room. She, a girl from the town of Columbus, where everyone knew each other and where her father still worked on tractors in the garage, could not believe that such a guy would choose her. But he chose, and here they were, with the keys to the house and a bunch of boxes that still needed to be unpacked. "Okay, let's bring it in," she said, tapping him on the shoulder. "Otherwise, we'll be stuck here until nightfall." They carried boxes for 2 hours, exchanging jokes and arguing about where to put the old sofa that Calvin refused to throw away because "I kissed you on it for the first time." Louise rolled her eyes, but secretly enjoyed his sentimentality. By evening, they collapsed on this same couch, sweaty and tired, with a Domino's pizza on their laps and 2 cans of Coke on the floor. "Do you know what I'm thinking?" Calvin asked, taking a bite of pepperoni. His voice was relaxed, slightly hoarse from fatigue. "About the fact that you should have ordered more garlic sauce?" she teased. "No, smart girl." He grinned and poked her nose with his finger. "About how cool it will be here when we have children. Imagine, little Harpers are running around the yard. You shout at them not to get into the mud, and I build them a swing." Louise froze with a piece of pizza in her mouth. She looked at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. They had discussed children before, but always in some distant future, someday when there is time. And now he sat here, with a stain of tomato sauce on his t-shirt, and talked about it so simply, as if it had already been decided. "Do you really want children?" she asked quietly. "Aren't you?" He raised an eyebrow, but there was no mockery in his voice, only curiosity. "I want it," she admitted, looking down at the pizza. I don't know. This is a big responsibility, and I just started my career. And you said to yourself that you want to get ahead at work first." Calvin shrugged, put down the crust, and wiped his hands on his jeans, a habit that had always annoyed her, but now seemed endearing. "Career is important, yes," he said, "but you are more important to me. And this house, and everything that we will build here. I'm not saying tomorrow, Lou. It's just, I see us here in 5 years. With a dog, with a couple of kids. And with you, of course." She smiled, feeling her cheeks warm. She put down the pizza, moved closer to him, and laid her head on his shoulder. His t-shirt smelled of sweat and a little beer, but she didn't care. This was her Calvin, the one who dreamed of a swing in the yard and looked at her as if she were the center of his world. "You're too perfect, you know," she muttered. "Sometimes I don't even believe you're real." "I'm not perfect," he objected, hugging her shoulders. "I'm just fucking in love with you." They sat like this for some more time, until it got dark outside the window, and only the chirping of cicadas broke the silence. Louise thought about how far they had come since they first met. She remembered their first date, how Calvin took her to a Waffle House and ordered her waffles with syrup because every Southern girl should love them. She laughed until she cried when he spilled coffee on his shirt while trying to look cool. And then there was their first New Year's together, when they danced to fireworks in the city center, and he whispered to her, "You are the best thing that happened to me." These were moments that she kept in her heart, like old photographs in an album. But even then, that evening on the couch, she noticed something. When they talked about the future, Calvin sometimes fell silent, looking somewhere to the side. Once, even before the wedding, he admitted to her that he was afraid of losing her not because of any specific reason, but simply because "you are too good for me." She then waved him off, called him a fool, and kissed him, but this fear did not seem to go away. And now, as she made herself more comfortable on his shoulder, he suddenly said, "Lou, what if you become a big boss? You will go on business trips and meet important people, and I'll stay here, fix bridges, and drink beer with the guys." She raised her head, surprised by his tone. He looked at her, and there was something strange in his eyes, an uncertainty that she had not noticed before. "And what?" she asked, frowning. "Do you think I'll leave you for some suit from the office?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just, you're so smart, so beautiful. Sometimes I think you could find someone better." Louise straightened up, feeling irritation boiling inside her. She hated it when he said that it wasn't the first time, and it hurt her every time. "Calvin, stop it," she said firmly. "You are no worse than me. You're an engineer, you're smart, you're damn cool. And I chose you, okay? So stop talking about this nonsense." He smiled, but the smile came out weak. He nodded and reached for the can. Coke, and took a long sip, as if washing away his words. Okay, he said, raising his hands in a playful gesture of surrender. "You're right. I'm just tired, I guess. Let's go to sleep, otherwise tomorrow we'll have to sort out these boxes." She looked at him for another second, but decided not to press. They put away the rest of the pizza, turned off the lights, and went upstairs to the bedroom, where for now there was only a bed with a bunch of pillows. Lying in the dark, Louise listened to Calvin breathe next to her and thought about what he had said. Her career was just beginning. She dreamed of working her way up, proving to herself and everyone that she could be more than just a girl from Columbus. But the thought that this could alienate her from Calvin struck her with anxiety for the first time. She turned to him, pressed closer, and closed her eyes. They were the golden couple, that's what their friends called them, and she believed that it would always be this way. Louise sat at her desk in the corner of the open space, staring at her laptop screen. It was filled with presentation slides for Delta Airlines graphs, tables, and a bunch of text that she had spent the last 2 hours trying to condense into 3 key points. Gray morning smog hung in the gray morning smog outside the windows of a 14th floor office in downtown Atlanta, and the air conditioner hummed inside, drowning out the clatter of keys and the occasional ringing of phones. It was 8:45 a.m., and she was already on her second cup of coffee black, no sugar, from the machine in the break room. Her head was buzzing from lack of sleep after her conversation with Calvin yesterday, but she brushed the thoughts aside. Work is work. Louise, are you finished with the third slide? The voice of James Wilson, her boss, came from behind the partition. He didn't come out of his office. He just shouted through the glass wall as usual. James was the type of boss who likes to command from a distance, but at the same time manages to keep everything under control. Almost, she answered, without taking her eyes off the screen. Another 10 minutes, and it will be ready. Do it in 5, he said. We have a meeting with a client at 10, and I want to see this before they come in. Louise pursed her lips, but remained silent. She was used to his manner. James was demanding, sometimes to the point of absurdity, but it was thanks to him that she rose from assistant to project manager in 3 years. He was about 40 tall, with gray hair at the temples and a charisma that made people either adore him or hate him. Louise was in the first camp. He gave her a chance when no one else would, and she appreciated it. She quickly completed the last paragraph, saved the file, and sent it to James via internal mail. Then she stood up, stretched her back, ached from sitting for too long, and headed towards his office. Her black trousers and white blouse were slightly wrinkled, but she didn't bother. Everyone in the office already knew that she was not here for a fashion show. Here, look, she said, knocking on the glass and going inside. James sat at a table littered with papers and empty coffee cups. His laptop was open, and the same slides she had just sent flashed on the screen. Quickly, he nodded, without looking up from the monitor. Sit down, let's go for a run. Louise plopped down in the chair opposite, crossing her legs. James's office was the only closed space in this realm of glass and open desks, the privilege of a senior manager. From here, there was a view of the entire office, rows of employees staring at screens, a coffee machine in the corner where people were always crowded, and a couple of sofas by the window where interns sometimes dozed. Look, James began, clicking on the slide. This is where you write about cost optimization. It's too dry. The client needs something catchy. Right, reducing costs, increasing profits. Sounds more cheerful. But it's the same thing, she objected, raising an eyebrow. Not the same thing, he chuckled. It's psychology, Lou. People love it when they are sold a dream, not numbers. You know how it works. She rolled her eyes but smiled. James was right. He always was right about these things. She picked up her notepad and quickly wrote down his edits as he scrolled further. And here, he pointed his finger at the screen, about deadlines. You indicated 4 months. Make it 3.5. Looks more ambitious. James, we can barely make it to 4, she said, leaning back in her chair. You saw the report from the analysts. Half of the data there is still raw. Then make it 3 months, he winked at her, and his lips stretched into a boyish smile. Kidding. Leave 4, but add, with the possibility of acceleration. Let them think that we are ready to give it our all. Louise laughed, briefly but sincerely. She loved these moments with James. He was strict, but knew how to diffuse the situation. They had been working together for 3 years, and during that time they had developed their own rhythm. She proposed ideas, he polished them, and together they produced results that made clients swoon. Sometimes they argued until they were hoarse, but in the end they always found a common language. Okay, you're the boss, she said, making another note. Anything else? Yes, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. You will present. I'll start, but I'll give the main part to you. You know the details better than anyone. She nodded, although she felt a shiver inside. Presenting to big clients like Delta was always a challenge, dozens of eyes waiting for you to stumble, and questions that don't always have answers. But she loved that adrenaline rush. This was her battlefield. "Okay, I'm ready," she said, standing up. "Then see you at 10. "Don't be late," he said after her, already burying his face back into his laptop. Louise left the office, closing the door behind her, and immediately felt the air in the office change. She couldn't explain it, but every time she left James's office, she was bombarded with stares. Not obvious ones, not ones to be caught red-handed, but furtively from behind monitors, from under eyelashes. She walked to her desk, trying not to pay attention, but still noticed how Emily Jenkins and Sarah Miller, two of her colleagues, glanced at each other at the coffee machine. Emily was younger than Louise, about 28, with long brown hair and bright makeup that she reapplied every couple of hours. Sarah, a little older, wore thin-framed glasses and always carried a tablet, as if she was more important than everyone in the room. They both worked in the sales department, but their main specialty, as they joked in the office, was information gathering. Or, more simply put, gossip. "Well, were you keeping it secret again?" came Emily's voice as Louise passed by. She said it quietly, but loud enough for Louise to hear. Louise stopped, turned to her, and narrowed her eyes. "What did you say?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Emily shrugged, taking a sip from her best wife ever mug. Her lips stretched into a sweet smile, but her eyes remained cold. "Nothing, just kidding," she replied. "You and James looked so cute through the glass." Just like in the series. Sarah giggled, covering her mouth with her hand as if it made her less noticeable. Louise felt her cheeks begin to burn, not from embarrassment, but from irritation. She knew the game Emily and Sarah loved to pick on her, especially after she got promoted a year ago. They didn't say anything directly, but their hints were razor sharp. "If you're so interested in what we talked about, you can go to James yourself and ask," Louise said, crossing her arms. "Or don't you have a job?" "Oh, Louise, don't be angry," Emily said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "We're just chatting. You're the star of the office. Everyone knows that." "Yes, star," Sarah said, adjusting her glasses. "James adores you. It's obvious." Louise clenched her fists, but forced herself to smile. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her angry. "Thanks for the compliment, girls," she said, turning to her desk. "Maybe you'll try to work too, and not just scratch your tongues. Clients are waiting." She heard them laugh quietly behind her, but did not turn around. Sitting down at the table, she opened the laptop and stared at the screen, although the letters blurred before her eyes. Her heart was pounding, and she hated herself for it. Why are these two chickens even picking on her? She knew that they were jealous her projects brought big contracts to the company, and their sales were barely staying afloat. But these jokes of theirs, these glances, they were like mosquitoes small, but annoying as hell. Half an hour later, she was already standing in the meeting room in front of the projector, with the remote control in her hand. James opened the meeting as usual, a couple of jokes, a little flattery for the clients, and then turned the floor over to her. Louise turned on the first slide, took a deep breath, and began. "Gentlemen, we offer you not just cost optimization, but a way to reduce costs and increase profits in the first quarter." She spoke with confidence, moving from slide to slide, answering questions, and even throwing in a couple of improvisations when clients began to hesitate. James sat in the corner, nodding and occasionally winking at her when she hit the mark. Towards the end of the meeting, the Delta representative, a balding man in an expensive suit, smiled and said, "Impressive. I think we are ready to discuss the details of the contract." Louise exhaled, feeling the tension release. They shook hands, exchanged business cards, and the clients left, leaving her and James in an empty meeting room. "Great job, Lou," he said, patting her on the shoulder. "You laid them on their shoulder blades." "Thank you," she replied, smiling. "But without your edits, I wouldn't have coped." "Oh, okay," he waved his hand. "It's all you. I just suggested a few words." They left the meeting room together, laughing as one of the clients almost fell asleep in the middle of the presentation. Louise didn't notice Emily and Sarah glance at each other again at the coffee machine. She didn't hear Emily whisper, Well, exactly. They are not just colleagues. Did you see how he looks at her? Calvin Harper pushed the door of the rusty nail bar open with his shoulder and was immediately overwhelmed by the smell of fried wings, spilled beer, and cheap cologne. It was about 7 in the evening, and the place was already buzzing. The TVs above the bar were broadcasting the Braves versus Phillies game. Men in baseball caps were shouting something about the pitcher, and somewhere in the corner a guitar was strumming as a local musician set up his equipment for a live performance. Calvin straightened the collar of his plaid shirt and made his way to the table in the far corner, where his friends Brian and Trevor were already sitting. "Well, finally, dude," Brian shouted, raising his bottle of Miller Lite in greeting. His red hair stuck out from under his Falcon's cap, and there was an empty bowl of buffalo sauce on the table in front of him. "I thought you were having romance at home with your wife again." "Fuck you," Calvin grinned, plopping down on a chair. He waved to the waitress, a young girl, and ordered a Bud Light. "I had a day at a construction site. I was covered in dust. I barely made it to the shower." Construction," Trevor drawled, leaning back in his chair. He was thin, had a short beard, and was wearing a Harley-Davidson t-shirt. "You're an engineer, not a loader. Why are they dragging you there?" "Quality control," Calvin replied with a shrug. "New bridge over the Chattahoochee. The concrete is cracking, the contractors are making mistakes, and then I take the rap in front of my boss. The usual thing." The waitress brought the beer, and Calvin took a long sip, feeling the cold bitterness running down his throat. It had indeed been a lousy day. He had spent 6 hours in the scorching sun, checking the fittings and arguing with the foreman, who seemed to have no idea what drawings were. And then there was this argument with Louise yesterday. Her words about, "You have to trust me," were still ringing in my head. He didn't want to think about it, but thoughts came naturally. "Okay, about work later," Brian said, slamming his hand on the table. "Let's get better at life. How is your Louise? Still the queen of the office?" Calvin tensed, but tried not to show it. He took another sip of beer and nodded. "Yes, okay. Work hard, as always. Yesterday I returned late, some urgent project." "It's late then," Brian squinted, and a familiar mockery appeared in his voice. "Who is she staying with there, huh? With that boss of yours? What's his name, Jason?" "James," Calvin corrected, feeling something tighten inside him. "And yes, with him. He's her boss, Bri. They do projects together." "Ooh, projects," Trevor said, grinning. "Is that what they call it now? Listen, dude, if I were you, I'd take a closer look. Bosses, love young and beautiful subordinates." "Fuck you," Calvin waved him off, but the smile came out forced. He knew his friends were just teasing him. That was their style, especially after a couple of beers. But today their words were more powerful than usual, maybe because he himself started asking questions after yesterday. Brian leaned closer, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes sparkled, either from the beer or from the desire to put on a show. "Seriously, Kel," he said, "I was chatting with a guy at a service center the other day. He runs a tire shop in your business center. He says he saw Louise with some guy in a suit. They left the office, they had a nice conversation and laughed. Was this your James by any chance?" Calvin froze with the bottle to his lips. He slowly lowered it onto the table, looking at Brian. "When was this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Yes, a couple of days ago," Brian shrugged. "In the evening, at 8 o'clock. I thought maybe it was you who took her, but he said an older man, a little gray, in a jacket, like a big boss." Calvin felt something hot and heavy boiling in his chest. He remembered the evening before yesterday. Louise came home around 9 and said that she was delayed because of an urgent report edit. He didn't attach any importance, then she often returned late. But now, after Brian's words, images began to spin in my head. Louise and James laughing in the parking lot, her hand on his shoulder, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary. "It doesn't mean anything," he said, more to himself than to his friends. "They work together. Of course they can laugh." "Well, yes, of course," Trevor said, rolling his eyes. "They are working. And then they go to a bar, then to a hotel. Just kidding, just kidding. Don't look at me like that. Calvin squeezed the bottle until his knuckles turned white. He knew Trevor was just fooling around, but the joke hit right where it hurt. He remembered how Louise looked yesterday tired, but with a slight smile, as if something was still amusing her. She said that James had come up with some kind of joke about the client, but did not give details. But he didn't ask. Listen, Kel, Brian lowered his voice, as if he was about to reveal a secret. I'm not saying that she's stirring up something there. But just think about it. She's beautiful, smart, and all businesslike. And here you are building bridges while she and James are riveting presentations. Men in suits, that's how they are, you know. Just give them a reason. Brian, get lost. Calvin cut him off. His voice became harsher than he intended, and his friends looked at each other. You don't know her at all. And James, too. This is a job, not some kind of series. Okay, okay, Brian raised his hands in surrender. I'm just saying what I heard. If you don't want to listen, don't. There was silence, broken only by the hum of the television and the clinking of glasses behind the counter. Calvin stared at his bottle, twirling it in his hands. He didn't want to believe Brian this guy liked to make stories bigger, especially after drinking beer. But the seed of doubt had already fallen into the soil, and it began to sprout. He remembered how Louise returned from a corporate party a couple of weeks ago in a new dress, with her hair down and smelling of wine. She said that she was dancing with colleagues, but then he noticed how she quickly went into the shower, as if washing off something, or someone. Okay, let's change the subject, Trevor said, slamming the table. How are the Braves doing? Will they fail again, or will they get out at least once? They've been screwed for 3 innings already, Calvin muttered, forcing himself to switch gears. It's as if the pitcher is holding the ball for the first time. The friends laughed, and the conversation flowed on about baseball, about work, about how Brian almost burned down the garage trying to fix the lawnmower. Calvin nodded, assented, even joked a couple of times, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. He imagined Louise in the office, behind the glass door of James's office, and her laughter, which he loved so much, but which now seemed alien. By 9 o'clock, they had finished their beer, paid, and went out into the parking lot. The air was warm, smelling of asphalt and exhaust. Brian tapped Calvin on the shoulder. Never mind it, man, he said. I was just blabbering. Louise is great, you know. I know, Calvin nodded, but his voice sounded muffled. He got into his Dodge Ram, started the engine, and drove onto the highway. The radio was playing some country music, but he turned it off, leaving only the hum of the engine. The house was quiet. Louise has not returned, yet she wrote in the morning that she would be late again today. Calvin threw his keys on the table, grabbed another beer from the fridge, and sat down on the couch. He turned on the TV, but looked not at the screen, but somewhere through it. Brian's words echoed in my head. I saw your Louise with some guy. He finished his beer in one gulp, crushed the can, and threw it into the corner. Damn, he muttered, rubbing his face with his hands. He wanted to believe Louise. She was his wife, his golden girl. But this evening in the bar, these stupid conversations, they left a taste he couldn't swallow. When Louise returned at 10:30, he was still sitting on the sofa, with an empty bottle in his hand. She walked in, dropped her bag at the door, and smiled at him. Hey, honey, she said, kicking off her shoes. How was your day? Fine, he answered without looking at her. And yours? Oh, don't ask, she sighed, sitting down next to him. James again created a circus with edits, but we managed. James, then, he repeated quietly, and his fingers tightened on the bottle. Louise didn't notice how his voice wavered. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. I'll take a shower, and then we'll eat, okay? She said, standing up. Shall we order something? Come on, he nodded, looking after her. She went upstairs, and he remained sitting, listening to the water turn on. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered, what if Brian was right? Louise was sitting behind the wheel of her Toyota RAV4, looking at the traffic light, which stubbornly burned red. It was 7:30 p.m., and the traffic on I-85 was an endless snake of headlights and horns. A light rain was drizzling outside the window, leaving streaks on the windshield, and the wipers creaked as if complaining of fatigue. She turned on the radio. Some station was playing the old hit, Sweet Home Alabama, but immediately turned it off because the silence seemed better than someone else's nostalgia. Her phone lay on the passenger seat, the screen blinking from a missed call from Calvin. She didn't answer because she had spent the last half hour in the office arguing with James about a new project, and she no longer had the energy to talk. When she finally turned onto their quiet street in suburban Atlanta, the rain picked up, pattering on the roof of the car. The house looked dark, except for the light from the living room window shining through the curtains like a beacon in the fog. Louise parked at the garage, grabbed her bag, and jumped out into the rain, covering her head with a folder of documents. By the time she reached the porch, her hair was wet and her black pants were stuck to her legs. "Calvin!" she shouted, pushing the door open and shaking water off her sleeves. The house smelled of something warm, maybe pizza or popcorn, and the low hum of voices coming from the TV came from the living room. She dropped her bag on the floor by the coat rack and reached for the hook for the towel that always hung there, but it was missing. "I'm here," Calvin's voice came from the depths of the house. He walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his jeans. He was wearing a dark hoodie and sneakers, as if he was about to go somewhere but changed his mind. His face was calm, but his eyes, dark, almost black in the dim light of the hallway, looked at her with some wariness. "Where did you put the towel?" she asked, squeezing out the ends of her hair. Drops fell to the floor, leaving small puddles on the wooden boards. "In the wash," he answered, crossing his arms. "You're all wet. Where were you?" Louise frowned, catching something strange in his tone, not just curiosity, but a slight prick disguised as concern. She walked past him into the kitchen, where there was an open box of Papa John's pizza on the table, pepperoni and cheese, half already eaten. "In the office, where else?" she said, opening the refrigerator and taking out a can of Diet Coke. The cold metal felt pleasant in her palm, and she pressed it to her neck, feeling the tension subside a little. "New client, a lot of edits. James decided that we needed to rewrite half of the proposal right before the deadline." "James," Calvin repeated, his voice a little lower. He leaned against the joint, watching as she opened the can and took a sip. "He again." Louise froze before she could reach her lips. She slowly turned to him, feeling something hot and familiar begin to boil inside. This tone, this name, pronounced with such subtext she had already heard it before, but today it cut even more. "Yes, James," she said, placing the jar on the table with a little more force than necessary. Metal clinked against granite. "My boss. You know how it works, Kel. What's wrong again?" Calvin shrugged, but his gaze never left her. He stepped closer, and the light from the kitchen lamp revealed the shadows under his eyes. He looked tired, but not from work, but from something else. "Nothing's wrong," he said, but the words sounded forced. "I just wonder how many more evenings you'll spend with him while I'm here eating pizza alone." Louise laughed shortly, harshly, almost joylessly. She crossed her arms, looking at him defiantly. "Are you serious now?" she asked. "Are you angry because I'm working, because I have deadlines and responsibilities?" "I'm not angry," he snapped, his voice getting louder. "I'm asking Lou. You are with him every damn day. You're sitting there in his office, laughing at something I don't even know about. What about me? I'm sitting here waiting for you to remember that you have a husband." Her eyebrows rose, and she felt her cheeks begin to burn. She took a step towards him, clenching her fists, not out of anger, but to stop herself from screaming. "Do you think I'm having fun there?" she said, lowering her voice, but it trembled with tension. "You think I'm sitting in the office drinking cocktails with James? I'm working, Calvin. Am I not working?" he barked, taking a step towards her. His face turned red, and he pointed his finger towards the window. "I've been at a construction site all day, knee-deep in mud, while you're there with this suit, discussing your important matters. But I come home, Lou, and you're gone, and I start to think. What should I think? She interrupted, her voice breaking into a scream. Come on, tell me. What do you think, Calvin? Why am I sleeping there with James? Is this what you want to hear? He froze, looking at her, and something flashed in his eyes, not anger, but pain mixed with confusion. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck, and instead he simply shook his head. That's not what I said, he muttered, stepping back. But think for yourself what it looks like. People say. People again. What kind of people? She stepped towards him. Her voice became sharp, like a blade. Brian, Trevor, these friends of yours who see betrayal in every corner? Or did someone else sing you some crap about me and James? Calvin clenched his jaw, and she saw his hands shaking, not from fear, but from suppressed anger. He turned to the window, looking at the rain, which was now hitting the glass with such force that it seemed like it was about to crack. It doesn't matter who, he said quietly. I hear it, Lou. And you don't do anything to make me stop thinking about it. Louise looked at him, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders, shake him, force him to look into her eyes and see that she was not who he took her for. But instead she retreated, leaning against the countertop. You have to trust me, Calvin, she said, and her voice wavered, betraying fatigue. I'm your wife. I didn't do anything to make you look at me like that. Nothing. He nodded but didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, as if he was holding the whole world on them. Louise waited a second, two, but he was silent. Finally, she exhaled, grabbed her can, and walked towards the stairs. I'm going to bed, she said without turning around. Good night. She went upstairs, feeling how each step felt like a heaviness in her body. In the bedroom, she threw the can on the nightstand, threw her wet clothes directly onto the floor, and collapsed on the bed, not even bothering to cover herself with the blanket. The rain pattered on the roof, and this sound was the only thing that broke the silence. Her thoughts revolved around Calvin, his words, his look, his silence. She knew he was jealous, but it was more than jealousy. It was mistrust, and it cut her like a knife. Below, Calvin stood at the window, looking out at the blurry lights of the street. The pizza had cooled down, and the TV was still muttering something about baseball, but he didn't hear it. His fingers squeezed the edge of the tabletop, and he felt everything boiling inside anger at himself, at Louise, at this damn rain. He didn't want to believe the gossip, didn't want to think about her and James, but these thoughts crawled into his head like cockroaches. He turned around, took another piece of pizza, and took a bite, but it tasted like cardboard. Then he turned off the light and lay down on the sofa without getting up to her. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to cross this crack between them. The morning in the office began with the usual hum, the clatter of keys, the smell of coffee from the machine, and the slight noise of the air conditioner, which drove cool air through the open space. Louise sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen, which was displaying a draft of a new proposal for a client, a construction company that wanted to update its branding. It was 9:15, and she had already sent James the first version, knowing that he would return it with a bunch of edits. After yesterday's argument with Calvin, she only managed to sleep for a couple of hours. She tossed and turned, listening to the rain, and in the morning she got up with a heavy head and dark circles under her eyes, which even the foundation couldn't hide. She sat back, rubbing her temples, and took a sip from her mug-white, marked Coffee Life, a gift from a colleague for her last birthday. The coffee was already cold, but she drank it anyway, because without it the day threatened to get even worse. Her thoughts kept returning to Calvin, to his words about people who talk, to the way he looked at her, as if she was a stranger. She wanted to talk to him in the morning, but he left for work earlier, leaving only a note on the refrigerator. See you in the evening. Neither love nor sorry, just cold letters. Louise, are you okay? James' voice came from behind the glass wall of his office. He didn't come out. He just shouted as usual, and she looked up, forcing herself to smile. Yes, everything is fine, she answered, although it was an obvious lie. Have you looked at the draft? I'm looking right now, he said, and she heard him click his mouse. Come in, let's discuss it. Louise stood up, picked up her laptop, and headed towards his office. As she walked past the coffee machine, she noticed Emily Jenkins standing there with a mug in her hands, chatting with Sarah Miller. Emily looked the same as always, long brown hair curled in light waves, bright lipstick, a low-cut blouse that screamed, "Look at me." Sarah, in her usual gray skirt and glasses, nodded, but her gaze slid to Louise, and something sharp flashed in it. "Good morning, girls," Louise said without stopping. She didn't want to give them a reason for further teasing, but Emily turned anyway, smiling her sweet, fake smile. "Good, Louise," she sang. Back to James. "You and him are literally inseparable." Louise pursed her lips, but remained silent, pushing open the office door. She knew it was useless to answer Emily, and Sarah fed on her reactions like vampires in blood. Inside, James sat at a desk littered with papers, flipping through her file on the screen. "Sit down," he said, without looking up from the monitor. "The first page is normal, but this section about the budget is too vague. We need specifics." Louise plopped down in her chair, opened her laptop, and nodded. "Okay, what exactly?" she asked, ready to take notes. Her voice sounded tired, and James noticed it. He looked up, squinting. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, leaning back. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "It's just a long night," she replied, waving him off. "Everything is fine. Let's talk about the budget." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for another second before he returned to the screen. They spent half an hour going over her draft. James suggested edits, she argued, but eventually agreed. It was their usual dance, and today it helped take her mind off Calvin. When they finished, James clapped his hands and smiled. "Great, Lou," he said. "Redo it by lunchtime, and I'll send it to the client." "Well done." "Thank you," she replied, standing up. "Then see you later." She left the office, feeling slightly relieved. Work had recently been her refuge, a place where she could forget about the storms at home. But this feeling lasted exactly until the moment she returned to her desk and saw Emily, who was standing at her place, holding the phone in her hands. "Oh, Louise, you're already here," Emily said, stepping back in feigned surprise. "I was just looking for a pen. Mine had disappeared somewhere." Louise narrowed her eyes on her. On her desk lay a whole bunch of pens, blue, black, even one with a stupid nib that she had won at the last corporate party. Emily was clearly lying, but Louise didn't bother. "Take it if you need it," she said, sitting down and opening her laptop. "Just don't lose it." Emily giggled, took one hand and walked away, swaying her hips. Louise shook her head and went back to work, unaware that Emily had just done something worse than steal a pen. Meanwhile, across town, Calvin was sitting in his Dodge Ram in a construction parking lot. He had just finished his morning round, checking the beams of the new Chattahoochee Bridge, arguing with the foreman, who had again messed up the measurements. His phone lay on the dashboard, and he looked at it like it was a bomb about to explode. In the morning, he called Louise. He just wanted to hear her voice, maybe apologize for yesterday, but she didn't answer. This hit him harder than he expected. He rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the stubble scratching his palms, and sighed. Yesterday's argument left a bitter taste. He knew he had gone too far, but Brian's words from the bar were still spinning in his head. "I saw your Louise with some guy." He didn't want to believe it, but these thoughts were like weeds. You pull one out, and two grow in its place. His phone suddenly vibrated, and he grabbed it, hoping to see Louise's name. But it was an unknown number. The message read, "Don't you think this is strange?" The text was accompanied by a photo, blurry, taken through glass, but he immediately recognized Louise. She was leaving the office with James, both laughing, and her hand on his shoulder, a small, friendly gesture, but from this angle it looked too close. Calvin squeezed the phone until the screen flickered. His heart began to pound, and he felt the blood rush to his face. He enlarged the photo, looking at the details: her smile, his relaxed pose. "Who filmed this? And why did you send it to him?" He dialed Louise's number, but hung up without waiting for the dial tone. Instead, he wrote to her. "Where are you now?" The answer came a minute later. "In the office, working." "Are you okay?" He stared at the screen, feeling everything boiling inside. but answered briefly, "Yes, see you at home." Then he threw the phone on the seat and slammed his fist on the steering wheel, cursing out loud. In the office, Emily sat at her desk, hiding her smile. She sent a photo from a burner number that she bought a couple of weeks ago for such small pranks. She took the photo by accident a couple of days ago when she stayed in the office to overhear what Louise and James were talking about. They walked out together, laughing at some joke, and Emily couldn't resist snapping them through the window. Now this photo was her little bomb, and she knew it would hit the target. "Are you sure this will work?" Sarah whispered, leaning towards her with a tablet in her hands. Her glasses slid down her nose a little, and she nervously adjusted them. "Of course," Emily answered without looking up from the screen. "Did you see how she left James's yesterday? Her whole face is red, as if she was caught. And her husband is a simple guy. He definitely won't swallow it. But if she finds out it's you—" Sarah began, but Emily cut her off with a wave of her hand. "She won't know," she said, her voice turning cold. "Nobody will know. And if they find out, I'll say that I just found the photo and sent it anonymously. Let him prove that it's me." Sarah nodded, but her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the tablet. Emily leaned back in her chair, looking at Louise across the office. She was sitting at the table buried in her laptop, and did not even suspect that her world had just received the first blow. By lunchtime, Louise had finished the edits and sent them to James. She stood up to pour herself more coffee, but her phone vibrated with a message from Calvin. "We need to talk." Her stomach clenched, and she felt the fatigue creep in with renewed vigor. She wrote, "Okay, in the evening," but there was no answer. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller stood at the coffee machine with a tablet in her hands, her thin-framed glasses sliding slightly down her nose. Emily Jenkins was nearby, scrolling through something on her phone, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. They were whispering, but their voices were loud enough to be heard by those standing nearby, a couple of interns and an it guy who was tinkering with the printer. "Did you see her leave James' office yesterday?" Sarah said, nodding towards Louise. "Her face is red, as if she was caught. They obviously weren't just talking about work there." Emily chuckled, not looking up from her phone. "Yes, she's with him every day," she answered, her voice sweet but poisonous. "I wouldn't be surprised if they go to a bar after work. Or somewhere else." Sarah adjusted her glasses and lowered her voice, but not too much, just enough to make it seem like a secret. "I heard from one client," she continued, "that they were seen together in a restaurant a couple of weeks ago. In the center, in some fashionable place. They drank wine and laughed. If I didn't know she was married, I would have thought it was a date." "Seriously?" Emily looked up, her eyebrows rising in mock surprise. "Well, her husband is clearly having fun. Imagine you're sitting at home, and your wife and her boss are drinking wine." The interns at the printer looked at each other. One of them chuckled, but quickly buried his face in the papers. Sarah noticed this and added, leaning closer to Emily, "And they say he is a simple guy, some kind of engineer. She probably doesn't even know who she works with there." Emily laughed loudly, theatrically, and several heads turned in their direction. Louise heard this laughter, but did not understand the words. She was too immersed in her thoughts. She stood up, took the laptop, and went to James, not noticing how Sarah followed her with her gaze, hiding her smile. In the office, James leafed through her file, making notes in the margins. He looked as usual, graying temples, shirt with rolled-up sleeves, a slight smile that appeared when he was pleased. "Not bad, Lou," he said as she sat down opposite him. "But here, about the deadlines, we need to be stricter. The client wants confidence that we will meet the deadline." "Okay," she nodded, opening her laptop. Her voice was mechanical, and James noticed it. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, leaning back. "For the second day, you look like you were run over by a truck." Louise forced herself to smile, but it turned out crooked. "I'm just tired," she answered. "At home. A little tense. It's okay. If there's anything, speak up," he said, his tone becoming softer. "You are my best employee, Lou. I don't want you to burn out." "Thank you," she muttered, and they went back to work. Meanwhile, Calvin sat in the construction site's hut, looking at his phone. After saying to Louise, "We need to talk," he waited for an answer, but it was short, "Okay," in the evening, only made him angrier. He didn't know what to say when he saw her, but the photo they sent him burned him from the inside. He opened it again, a blurry shot of Louise and James in the car park, her hand on his shoulder, their laughter. Someone took it and sent it to him, and now he couldn't get the picture out of his head. He threw the phone on the table and rubbed his face with his hands. Calvin stood up, took a bottle of water from the refrigerator, and took a long sip, but it didn't help. He wanted to believe her. His phone vibrated, a call from Trevor. Calvin answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Dude, are you alive?" Trevor's voice rang out, noisy and cheerful. "Brian and I are at Rusty Nail in the evening, drinking beer. Will you go?" "I don't know," Calvin muttered. "Things to do at home." "What's going on?" Trevor chuckled. Calvin clenched his jaw, feeling the blood rush to his face. "Don't start, Trev," he said, his voice becoming harsher. "I'm not in the mood." Okay, Trevor raised his hands, although Calvin didn't see it. "I just asked. But have you heard what people are saying? One guy from your office, well, not yours, but hers. He said that Louise was seen with James in the restaurant. The two of us, like on a date." Calvin froze, his fingers gripping the bottle until the plastic cracked. "Who said?" he asked quietly. "I don't know, some bald guy from sales," Trevor answered. "Brian met him. Maybe bullshit, but I thought you might be interested." "Thank you," Calvin managed and hung up. He threw the bottle into the trash and sat down, staring into space. Restaurant, wine, laughter. It was the same thing Sarah had been chatting in the office, the same thing he was now hearing from Trevor. There were too many coincidences. He took the phone and texted Louise, "Were you and James at the restaurant?" The message went away and he waited, looking at the screen, but there was no answer. 10 minutes later, he stood up, grabbed his keys, and walked out to his Dodge Ram. He needed to go home. I needed to see her. In the office, Sarah watched as Louise returned to her desk. She turned to Emily, hiding her smile. "Do you think he already knows?" she whispered. "After my photo?" Emily grinned. "If not, he will soon find out." "Well done, about the restaurant, that's brilliant." "I just said what I heard," Sarah shrugged, but her eyes sparkled. "Let him suffer now." They looked at each other, and their quiet laughter disappeared into the noise of the office. Calvin was driving his Dodge Ram down the highway. It was about 5 in the evening, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows on the asphalt. The traffic was heavy, a Friday traffic jam of cars rushing home or to the bars, but he didn't notice any horns or blinkers. The radio in the car was silent. He turned it off at the construction site, because the music was just annoying. Instead, he heard the hum of the engine and his own breathing, heavy and uneven. He turned off the highway onto a quiet road that led to his father's house in suburban Marietta. He needed someone to talk to, and Brian and Trevor were the last people he wanted to see right now. Their teasing only added fuel to the fire. Father, Jack Harper, was different, rude, straightforward, but always said what he thought. Calvin didn't visit him often. Jack had become even more withdrawn since his mother's death 5 years ago, but today he was the only one who could give advice. Jack's house was at the end of the street, an old ranch house with peeling paint on the shutters and an overgrown lawn. There was a rusty lawnmower lying in the yard and a couple of plastic chairs, one of which was broken, on the porch. Calvin parked at the curb, turned off the engine, and sat for a minute, looking at the house. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to leave. The door was opened by Jack, tall, with short gray hair and wrinkles that made his face look like a map. He was wearing an old Atlanta Braves t-shirt and jeans and holding a can of Coors Light in his hand. "Calvin," Jack narrowed his eyes, looking at his son. "What are you up to? I thought you and Louise were at some fancy dinner." "Hey, Pa," Calvin said as he walked inside. The house smelled of tobacco and something fried, probably the bacon Jack had cooked that morning. "Can I come in?" "You're already in," Jack muttered, closing the door. He walked into the living room where there was a blanket on the old couch, and the TV was showing a replay of the Braves game with the sound off. Would you like some beer? Come on, Calvin nodded, sitting down in the chair opposite. Jack grabbed another can from the refrigerator in the corner, tossed it to his son, and plopped down on the couch. Well, lay it out, he said, taking a sip of beer. You didn't come here just like that. What happened? Calvin opened the can, took a sip, and stared at it as if it held the answer. The cold metal calmed him a little, but the words got stuck in his throat. It's about Louise, he finally said, his voice low and muffled. I don't know what to think, Pa. People say all sorts of things. Jack raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. What stuff? He asked. Is she in trouble? No, that's not it. Calvin shook his head. About her and her boss, James. It's like they have something. I heard they were seen together in a restaurant, in a parking lot, and they sent me a photo. She laughs with him, hand on shoulder. I don't know if this is true or not, but it bugs me. Jack leaned back on the couch, rubbing his chin. He was silent for a second, looking at his son, then took another sip of beer. And you believe this nonsense? He asked finally. I don't want to believe it, Calvin replied, squeezing the can until it crumpled slightly. But it gets into your head. She comes in late and works with him every day. And yesterday I asked, and she got angry. She said that I should trust her. Do you trust? Jack narrowed his eyes. His voice became harsher. Calvin fell silent, looking at the floor. Does he trust? He loved Louise more than anyone. She was his golden girl, the one with whom he built a house and dreamed of children. But these rumors, this photo, her silence on his SMS, all this hit him like a hammer on a nail. I don't know, he admitted quietly. But, damn, Dad, I don't want to be a cuckold. I don't want people whispering behind my back. Jack chuckled, put the can on the table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Listen here, son, he said, his voice rough but firm. You're a man. If you don't like something, figure it out. Don't sit here and whine like a kid. Talk to her like a human being. And if she is lying, you will understand it. You're not a fool. I tried. Calvin looked up, anger flashing in his voice. It's closing. He says this is work, I have to believe. And I sit and think, maybe I really am a fool. Then check, Jack snapped, his gaze turning cold. Don't take her word for it or those gossips. Keep an eye on her if necessary. Find out for yourself. But don't sit here like a beaten dog. A man's pride, Kel. Prove that you are a man and not a wimp. Calvin froze, looking at his father. Keep an eye on Louise. This thought had crossed his mind before, but he had pushed it away. It was too low, too unlike him. But now, after Jack's words, it stuck in her head. Maybe this is really the only way to find out. Don't believe rumors, don't guess, but see with your own eyes. Are you serious? He asked, his voice trembling. What did you think? Jack shrugged. I didn't do that to your mother, because I knew her like the back of my hand. But if you don't know what's under your nose, find the answer. Just don't get caught, otherwise it will be worse. Calvin nodded, but everything was boiling inside. He finished his beer, crushed the can, and threw it on the table. Jack looked at him as if waiting for him to say more, but Calvin stood up. Thanks, Pa, he said, heading towards the door. I'll think about it. Think faster, Jack said after him. And don't be an idiot. Calvin stepped out onto the porch, feeling the evening air cool his face. The sun had almost set, and the sky turned crimson. He got into the car, started the engine, and sat for a minute, looking at the house. Keep an eye on Louise. It was crazy, but at the same time it was like an electric shock. He didn't want to believe the gossip, but he couldn't live in this fog any longer. He took out his phone and opened a text message from Louise. Okay, in the evening. Then he wrote, Where are you now? The answer came in a couple of minutes. In the office, finishing up. Today is a corporate party, remember. Will you come? Calvin pursed his lips. Corporate James will be there. And she, he wrote. Yes, a gin, but a plan was already spinning in my head. He won't just sit there and watch them laugh in front of him. He will arrive earlier, see what happens before everyone gets there. He'll see for himself. He pulled out onto the road, heading home to change clothes. His heart was pounding, but now in this pounding there was not only anxiety, but something as hard as steel. A man's pride, Jack said, and Calvin decided it was time to show it off. Calvin parked his Dodge Ram across the street from Louise's office building, in the shade of an old oak tree that partially hid the car from view. It was about 6 in the evening, and the sun had already set, leaving the sky in shades of purple and gray. The street lights were just starting to come on, casting a soft glow on the parking lot in front of the glass facade of the business center. He turned off the engine, but left the keys in the ignition in case he had to leave quickly. His heart was pounding, and he felt like an idiot, but his father's words, "Prove that you are a man," echoed in my head. He arrived home after talking with Jack, changed into a dark sweatshirt and jeans so as not to stand out, and told himself that this was not surveillance, but just a check. Louise wrote that today was a corporate party, and he replied that he would come, but did not specify when. He wanted to see her earlier before the crowd gathered in the restaurant, before she put on her corporate smile. He needed to know what happened when she thought he wasn't around. The building was tall, with rows of illuminated windows, and he knew her office was on the 14th floor. Through the glass doors of the entrance, he saw a security guard behind the counter and a couple of people coming out with briefcases the end of the working day. Calvin leaned back in his seat, rubbing his hands. His palms were damp despite the cool evening. He took out his phone and opened the last text message from Louise. "In the office, finishing up. Today is a corporate party, remember? Will you come?" His answer is, "Yes, I will come," was sent an hour ago, and she didn't write anymore. He had been waiting for about 20 minutes when he saw her car, a white Toyota RAV4, in the parking lot. She stood closer to the entrance, under the lantern, and he remembered how they chose her together 2 years ago. Louise wanted something practical, and he joked that she wanted a pickup truck like his. Then they laughed, and everything was simple. Now he sat there like a spy from a cheap movie, and he hated himself for it. The door of the building opened, and he tensed, peering at the figures. It was not Louise, some guy in a suit with a backpack, followed by a woman with a child, probably from the kindergarten on the first floor. Calvin exhaled, feeling his nerves stretch like strings. He didn't know what he was waiting for, maybe her and James, walking together, laughing like in that photo, or her alone, tired, with a bag over her shoulder. He just wanted to see the truth, whatever it was. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, and he saw her. Louise came out dressed in a dark blue dress, which he did not immediately recognize. She probably changed in the office before the corporate event. Her hair was down, and she was carrying her laptop bag with a strap slung over her shoulder. She stood at the entrance, looking at her phone, and Calvin felt a pang of guilt. She looked the same as always, his Louise, and he sat there, hiding like a coward. But then the door opened again, and James came out. Calvin gripped the steering wheel, his breath stopping. James was in a dark jacket, without a tie, with a relaxed gait, as if the whole world belonged to him. He said something to Louise, and she turned and smiled. They stood at the entrance, talking, and Calvin tensed, trying to make out the details through the car window. The distance was too far to hear, but he saw James laugh and Louise nod, jabbing him in the side with her elbow. His stomach clenched. It was innocent, just colleagues chatting before a party, but in his head it looked different. He remembered the photo, Trevor's words. Louise's every gesture, her smile, her slight push seemed like evidence, although he knew it was stupid. Then James hugged her briefly, in a friendly way, slapping her on the shoulder, like guys do in a bar. Louise laughed, waved it off, and walked to her car. James headed to his own, a black BMW in the corner of the parking lot. Calvin watched her get into the RAV4, turn on the headlights, and drive out onto the road. James drove in the other direction, and within a minute the parking lot was empty. Calvin exhaled, feeling his hands shake. He didn't know what he expected to see: a kiss, secret meeting. What he saw was ordinary colleagues who get along well, nothing more. But why then was everything burning inside? Why did this laughter, this hug seem like a betrayal to him? He started the engine and drove home, keeping his distance from her car. He needed to change clothes and go to the corporate party he promised, and now it was too late to retreat. But there was a plan in my head. He would be there, watching. If something is wrong, he will notice it. At home, he threw the keys on the table and went into the bedroom. Louise had already left. Her shoes were lying by the door, and her bag with her laptop was in the kitchen. She left a note on the refrigerator. I left for a corporate party. I'm waiting for you at the Southern Grill. Come to 8. Calvin clenched the note in his fist, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. He put on a plaid shirt and jeans, looking at himself in the mirror. His face was tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but he straightened up, trying to regain his steadiness. A man's pride, Jack said. He won't whine. He will find out the truth. When he arrived at the Southern Grill, the party had already begun. The room was buzzing with music, a cover band was playing Hotel California, and the smell of fried shrimp mingled with whiskey smoke. Louise stood at the bar with James, holding a glass of wine, laughing at something he said. Calvin stood at the entrance, looking at her through the crowd. She was beautiful, the dress emphasized her figure. Her hair shone in the light of the lamps, but her smile addressed to James cut him like a knife. He walked to a table in the corner, took a beer from the waitress, and sat down to watch. His gaze caught every gesture, the way she tilted her head, the way James patted her on the shoulder. It was the same as what he had seen in the parking lot, but here, in the noise of the crowd, it looked different, closer, more dangerous. A few minutes later, he heard Sarah's voice at the next table. She was chatting with Emily, her margarita sloshing around in her glass. Did you see them sitting in the restaurant? Sarah said, loud enough for him to hear. Wine, candles, everything is as it should be. If I were her husband, I would have done something long ago. Calvin clutched his glass, his fingers trembling. He stood up without thinking and walked towards the bar. Louise turned when she saw him and smiled. Hello, she said, but he didn't return the smile. Is it fun here? He asked, nodding at James. D.O., it's just begun, James answered, not noticing his tone. Persuade her to dance, she refused me. Calvin looked at Louise, his voice becoming cold. I heard about the restaurant, he said. Wine, laughter, this is true. Her smile disappeared, and she stepped towards him. What restaurant? She asked, her voice trembling. What are you talking about? Sarah was just chatting with a friend about this, he snapped. And I'm tired of hearing it, Lou. His nerves gave way. He turned around and walked towards the exit without waiting for an answer. Louise ran after him, but he was already in the parking lot, in the cold rain that had just begun. His hands shook on the steering wheel, not from the cold, but from the anger and shame that fought inside him. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to look like a fool in front of everyone. But Sarah's words about the restaurant, Louise's laugh with James, all this broke him. He turned onto their street, parked at the house, and sat for a minute, looking at the dark windows. The light in the living room was not on Louise, had not returned yet. The rain pattered on the roof of the car, and he felt as if he was drowning not in water, but in his own thoughts. Calvin climbed out of the car, ignoring the rain that immediately soaked his plaid shirt. He entered the house, threw the keys on the table at the entrance, and walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and he opened it, pulling out a bottle of Bud Light. The cold metal burned his fingers, but he took a long sip, hoping the beer would wash away the taste of the night. It didn't help. He sat down at the table, looking at the empty note that he had crumpled up in the morning. Her words, "Waiting for you at the Southern Grill," were still before my eyes. He didn't know how much time had passed. 10 minutes, 20 when he heard the sound of an engine. The headlights of her Toyota RAV4 illuminated the window, and a second later the door opened. Louise walked in, wet from the rain, her dark blue dress clinging to her legs and her hair hanging in damp strands. She dropped her bag at the threshold, kicked off her shoes, and froze when she saw him at the table. Her green eyes were red. She was crying, and it hit him harder than he expected. "Calvin," she said, her voice shaking with fatigue and anger. "What was that?" You left without even talking to me, in front of everyone." He clutched the bottle, looking at her from across the kitchen. The light of the lamp fell on her face, highlighting the tears that she did not have time to wipe away. "What should I have done?" He replied, his voice low and hoarse. "Stand there and listen to you laugh with him. How does Sarah tell everyone about your restaurant?" Louise stepped towards him, her fists clenching. "Which restaurant, Calvin?" she almost shouted. "I haven't been to any restaurant with James. This is bullshit that Sarah made up and you believed. Then why do I hear this?" he barked, standing up. The bottle clinked on the table. "Why do they send me a photo of you laughing with him? Why does Trevor say the same thing? Is this a coincidence?" She froze, her eyes widening. "What photo?" she asked. Her voice became quieter, but steel rang in it. "Are you talking about what you wrote yesterday? Show me." Calvin pulled his phone out of his pocket, opened the message, and tossed it on the table. The photo, blurry, taken through glass, showed her and James in the parking lot, her hand on his shoulder, their smiles. Louise took the phone, peering at the photo, and her face turned pale. "That was a couple of days ago," she said, looking up. "We finished the project and went out together. He joked about the client. I laughed. That's it, Calvin. All. He stepped towards her, his voice becoming louder. "What about a hug? I saw you today, Lou, before the corporate event. You hugged him in the parking lot." Louise opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She looked at him, her breathing quickening. "Were you following me?" she finally managed, her voice shaking with shock. "Did you? Sit there and watch." Calvin clenched his jaw, feeling his face heat up. He didn't want to admit it, but now there was nowhere to retreat. "Yes," he said, his voice was firm, but inside everything was crumbling. "I wanted to know. I wanted to see for myself and not listen to gossip." She stepped back, her hand on her chest as if protecting herself. "You don't believe me," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "After everything we've had, you think I'm lying to you." "I don't know what to believe," he shouted, hitting the table with his fist. The bottle jumped and fell to the floor, beer spilling on the tiles. "You are with him every day, Lou, every damn day, and I sit here and hear people laughing at me. No one is laughing at you." Her voice broke into a scream, and she stepped towards him, her eyes shining with tears. "You're the one laughing at me, Calvin. Do you think I'm like that? That I'm sleeping with my boss behind my husband's back? Do you really hold me like this?" He froze, looking at her. Her words hit him like a slap in the face, and he felt his anger recede, leaving a void. He didn't think so, he didn't want to think. But these rumors, this photo, her closeness with James, they choked him like smoke. "Tell the truth, Lou," he said, his voice becoming quieter, but there was pain in it. "Say that there is nothing between you, or I'm leaving." Louise looked at him, her lips trembling. She wiped her tears with her sleeve, but they flower again. "There is nothing between us," she said, each word falling like a stone. "Nothing, Calvin. He's my boss, my friend, and that's it. But if you don't believe me, if you can follow me like I'm a criminal, then I don't know who we are." He nodded, but his eyes were empty. He stepped towards the door, took the keys from the table, and stopped. "I need to think," he said without turning around. "I'll spend the night at Jack's." "Calvin, don't go." Her voice trembled, and she extended her hand, but he had already opened the door. The rain poured in, cold and harsh, and he stepped into it without looking back. Louise stood there, listening to his car start and drive away. She collapsed on a chair, covering her face with her hands, and cried quietly, silently, while the rain hammered on the windows. Her heart was breaking with pain and anger, and she didn't know how to stop it. Calvin drove to his father's house, feeling the rain wash away everything: his pride, his love, his faith. Louise woke up to the sound of an alarm clock, sharp as a siren, which tore her out of a restless sleep. It was 6 in the morning, and it was still dark outside the bedroom window, only the faint light of the lanterns breaking through the curtains. She lay on the bed, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of Calvin, his cologne, his warmth. His pillow was untouched, and the silence in the house was oppressive, reminding him that he was gone. She closed her eyes, hoping it was a dream, but the ringing of the phone on the nightstand brought her back to reality. She reached out to him. Wincing from the pain in her neck, she slept curled up, as if her body knew that something was broken. James' name flashed on the screen, and she answered, pressing the phone to her ear. "Louise, are you alive?" His voice was cheerful, but with slight anxiety. "We have a meeting with Delta at 9. Do you remember?" "Yes, I remember," she muttered, her voice hoarse from tears and lack of sleep. "I'll be there." "Are you okay?" he asked, and she heard him take a sip of coffee, probably already in the office. "After yesterday, it was like you disappeared." "It's okay," she lied, sitting up on the bed. "Just family matters. I'll be there soon." "Okay, but if there's anything, tell me," he said. "I need you 100% today." She nodded, although he didn't see it, and hung up the call. Then she stood up, feeling her legs trembling with fatigue. In the bathroom mirror, she saw herself pale, with red eyes and disheveled hair. This was not the same Louise who laughed at the corporate party yesterday. This was a woman whose marriage was cracking at the seams, and she didn't know how to mend it. She washed her face with cold water, forcing herself to compose herself. Work was her salvation, the only thing she could control. She put on a black suit, formal but comfortable, pulled her hair into a low bun, and applied a little foundation to hide the traces of the night. She drank coffee in the kitchen, standing by the window, looking at the empty courtyard, where the puddles from the rain still glistened. Calvin didn't call or write, and this silence was louder than any words. By 7:30, she was on her way to the office, her Toyota RAV4 humming quietly on I-85. The radio was playing something from Fleetwood Mac, but she turned it off. The music was just annoying. Her thoughts revolved around yesterday, Calvin, his scream, his departure. He was watching her. This word, followed, hit her like a hammer, and she could not understand how they got to this point. When she entered the office on the 14th floor, life was already in full swing. The tables were littered with papers, someone was typing up reports, and people were already crowding around the coffee machine. She walked to her seat, threw her bag on the chair, and opened her laptop. James shouted from his office, "Louise, come in. We have half an hour before the meeting." She took coffee black, without sugar, from the machine and went to him. James sat at the table, leafing through the presentation, his shirt slightly wrinkled, but his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Are you ready?" he asked, nodding towards the chair. "Delta will sign a contract today if we push them through." "Ready," she answered, sitting down. Her voice was even, but inside everything was trembling. She opened the laptop, and they began final edits, rehearsing key points. James joked as usual, but she answered mechanically, smiling only out of politeness. By 9, they were in the meeting room, she, James, and 3 Delta representatives in expensive suits. Louise stood in front of the projector, turned on the first slide, and began. "Gentlemen, we offer not just optimization, but real profit growth in the first quarter." Her voice sounded confident, despite the storm inside. She moved from slide to slide, answering questions, adding numbers she knew by heart. James sat in the corner, nodding and occasionally making comments. Towards the end of the meeting, the head of Delta, a balding man with a gold watch, smiled and said, "Impressive. We are ready to sign. Let's discuss the details." Louise exhaled, feeling the tension release. They shook hands, exchanged business cards, and the clients left, leaving her and James in an empty room. "You were great, Lou," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "This is your triumph. Congratulations." "Thank you," she replied, smiling weakly. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Nonsense," he waved his hand. "It's all you. Are we celebrating today?" "Not today," she said, her voice wavering. "Tired." He nodded without insisting, and they left the meeting room. Louise returned to her desk, feeling slightly relieved the work had done its job, giving her a moment of victory. But as she sat down, Emily and Sarah approached her. Emily looked the same as always, bright lipstick, a low-cut blouse, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sarah held the tablet, her glasses sparkling under the lights. "Well, Louise," Emily began, crossing her arms. "We heard how you and James put the clients to bed." "Just a star." "Thank you," Louise replied, without looking up from the screen. She knew that tone sweet, but with poison. "Yes, star," Sarah said, adjusting her glasses. "James absolutely adores you." Yesterday at the corporate party, this was visible. "Where was your husband?" "Left early, right?" Louise froze, her fingers stopping on the keyboard. She raised her eyes, looking at them, and for the first time in a long time, her patience snapped. "You are pathetic," she said, her voice cold and hard. "Both. All you can do is whisper and make up nonsense. If you don't have a job, find one and don't interfere in my life." Emily opened her mouth, but didn't say anything, her smile faltering. Sarah stepped back, clutching the tablet like a shield. "Oh, Louise, don't be mad," Emily managed, but her voice was strained. "We're just joking." "Take your joke somewhere else," Louise snapped, returning to her laptop. "I don't have time." They walked away, whispering to each other, and Louise exhaled, feeling her hands tremble. She knew they wouldn't stop, but she didn't care today. She's a winner, she had a contract, she did her job, and that was the only thing that kept her afloat. By evening, she was left alone in the office. Everyone had left, even James left, slapping her on the shoulder goodbye. She sat at her desk, staring at the blank screen, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to think about Calvin. Her phone was nearby, but she didn't call him. Pride or fear kept her caged. When she returned home, the house was empty. She dropped her bag at the door, walked into the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator to reveal the bottle of wine she and Calvin had bought last week. She poured herself a glass, sat down at the table, and cried quietly, silently, while the wine cooled in her hands. Calvin sat at the rusty nail bar, staring at a half-empty bottle of Bud Light on a wooden table covered in scratches and beer stains. It was about 8 on a Saturday night, and the place was buzzing. The TVs above the counter were showing the Falcons versus Saints game. Men in caps were shouting something about the quarterback, and in the corner, a guitar was strumming. A local musician was singing something from the repertoire of Lynyrd Skynyrd. The smell of frying wings and spilled whiskey hung in the air, but Calvin barely noticed it. His thoughts were somewhere far away at home, with Louise, in the kitchen where he left her in the rain. He came here after spending the night with his father. Jack didn't ask him in the morning, he simply said, "You'll figure it out," and went to repair his old Ford in the garage. Calvin couldn't sit in that house. He drove away, not knowing where, and ended up here, in the bar where he usually drank with Brian and Trevor. But today he was alone. He didn't want to see them, didn't want their jokes and questions. The waitress, the same girl with the tattoo on her wrist, walked by, throwing him a smile. "More beer?" she asked, her voice drowning out the noise of the crowd. "Go ahead," he nodded without looking up. She left, and he took a sip from the bottle, feeling the cold bitterness slide down his throat. This was already the third, but it did not help. It did not wash away the anger, guilt, or melancholy that burned him from the inside. His fingers hovered over the phone screen. He wanted to write to her anything, even forgive, at least, "Are you home?" But pride, or something similar, held him back. He threw the phone on the table, and immediately they brought new beer. Calvin nodded to the waitress, took the bottle, and took a sip, feeling the cold burn his tongue. Yesterday's scene at the corporate party was spinning in my head like a broken record. He loved her. This was the first thing he knew for sure. Calvin leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands. The stubble scratched his palms. He had not shaved since yesterday, and it made him look like a tramp. He remembered their first New Year's together, how they danced to the fireworks in the center of Atlanta, how she clung to him, whispering, "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Everything was simple then, and now he was sitting in a bar, alone, with a bottle of beer and a bunch of questions to which he did not know the answer. "Calvin, is that you?" A voice came from nearby, and he looked up. It was Brian, his red hair sticking out from under his Falcon's cap and holding a tray of wings and beer. Trevor loomed behind him, thin, wearing a Harley-Davidson t-shirt. "Yeah, me," Calvin muttered, not particularly happy about their appearance. Dude, you're like a ghost, Brian said, plopping down on the chair opposite him. Trevor sat down next to him, throwing the wings on the table. We called you yesterday, but you disappeared. What happened? Nothing, Calvin replied, taking a sip of his beer. I'm just resting. Come on, Trevor chuckled, biting off a wing. You look like you've been run over by a truck. Is it because of Louise? Calvin clenched his jaw, his gaze hardening. Don't interfere, Trev, he said quietly. I don't want to talk about it. Okay. Brian raised his hands as if giving up. But have you heard what people are talking about? That bald guy from her office was here yesterday. He said that Louise and her boss looked almost like a couple at the corporate party yesterday, and you left, slamming the door. Calvin froze, his fingers clenching the bottle until the glass nearly cracked. He looked at Brian, feeling his stomach boil. And what? He asked, his voice becoming cold. Are you collecting gossip now? Not me, dude, Brian shrugged. I'm just paraphrasing. People saw you run away, and she ran after you. The drama came out great. Shut up, Calvin snapped, his voice drowning out the noise of the bar. A few heads turned in their direction, but he didn't care. Stop talking about this nonsense, both of you. Trevor raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, chewing on a wing. Brian leaned back in his chair, looking at Calvin with a slight grin. Okay, whatever you say, he said. But if anything happens, we are here. Let's drink beer and talk. Calvin nodded, but didn't answer. He finished the bottle, threw a couple of dollars on the table, and stood up. I have to go, he said, putting on a sweatshirt. See you. He walked out into the parking lot, feeling the cool air hitting his face. There was no rain, but the sky was as heavy as his thoughts. He got into the car, started the engine, and sat for a minute, looking at the bar through the glass. Brian and Trevor remained inside, and he was glad their words only added fuel to the fire. He drove to Jack's house, but stopped halfway, turning into a gas station. There he bought more beer, a six-pack of Bud Light, and parked on the side of the road, looking at the empty road. He opened one bottle, took a sip, and took out his phone. His finger hovered over Louise's name, and he dialed her number. The beeps went on for a long time, 1, 2, 3, but she did not answer. He hung up the call, feeling his chest tighten. He imagined her at home in their kitchen, with a glass of wine alone. Or maybe she's still in the office with James. The thought cut through him, and he slammed his fist on the steering wheel, cursing out loud. Calvin finished his beer, opened another one, and turned on the radio. Sweet Home Alabama was playing the same song he had heard with Louise their first year together when they drove to the lake. He closed his eyes, remembering her laughter, her hand in his, her voice. You are my home, Kel. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them away, clenching his jaw. He didn't know how to get back. I didn't know how to trust her again. Louise sat at her desk in the office, looking at the laptop screen where a report on a new project was glowing. It was about 3 o'clock Monday afternoon, and a gray fog hung outside the 14th floor windows, making Atlanta look like a blurry photograph. The open space was quiet. Most of the employees had gone to lunch, leaving only the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional click of keys. Her coffee mug stood nearby, long cold, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts were somewhere far away at home, with Calvin in the emptiness that remained after his departure. She did not sleep almost all night. She sat in the kitchen with a glass of wine. In the morning, she forced herself to get up, get dressed, and go to the office, because work was the only thing that didn't collapse under her. James shouted from his office, without looking up from the monitor. Louise, come in. We need to discuss something. She sighed, took the laptop, and walked towards him. As she walked past the coffee machine, she noticed Emily and Sarah whispering, leaning over Sarah's tablet. Emily glanced at her quickly, coldly, with a slight grin, but Louise passed by without reacting. After their confrontation on Friday, she decided that she would not let them drag her into their games anymore. It was warm in James's office. He always turned on the heater, despite the air conditioning in the office. His desk was littered with papers, empty coffee cups, and a couple of pens that he always lost. He sat in a chair, flipping through something on the screen, his graying temples glistening under the lamp. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the chair. "We need to go over to the new client. They want a meeting this week." Louise sat down, opened her laptop, and nodded. "Okay, what kind of client?" she asked, her voice level but tired. "A construction company from Dalton," he answered, taking a sip of coffee from his cup. "They want a complete rebranding. I thought you could take on the bulk of it." "Okay," she said, making a note. "When is the deadline?" "End of the week," he smiled, but then squinted at her. "Are you sure you're okay, Lou? You look, I don't know, like you've been hit by a train." She forced herself to smile, but it came out crooked. "I just didn't get enough sleep," she answered. "Everything is fine. Let's talk about the project." He nodded without insisting, and they began discussing details, deadlines, key points. James was in his usual rhythm, joking, offering ideas, sometimes arguing with her over small things. It distracted her, as always, but today she found herself looking at him a little differently. After Kelvin's words, "I saw you today, you were hugging him," every gesture of James seemed to her under a magnifying glass. But he was the same as always, open, friendly, without a hint of anything more. When they finished, James stood up, stretched, and said, "I need to jump back for a couple of minutes. I'll leave you here, look at the draft, and correct it if anything happens." "Okay," she nodded, and he left, slamming the door. Louise remained in the office, looking at his screen, where the file with their project was open. She reached for her mug, but remembered that she had left it on the table and decided to grab some water from the cooler in the corner. Walking past James' desk, she accidentally touched a stack of papers, and they fell to the floor with a dull rustle. She cursed quietly, sat down, and began collecting sheets of paper reports, notes, a couple of receipts from the coffee shop. But under one of the sheets, she saw a photo small, slightly crumpled, obviously fallen out of a pocket or folder. Louise picked it up, and her breath froze. The picture was of Emily in a tight dress, with a glass of wine in her hand, hugging James. They were standing somewhere in a restaurant, a dark background, candles on the table, an intimate atmosphere. James smiled, his arm resting on her waist, and Emily looked at him with obvious adoration. On the back of the photo was handwritten, "A night that will not be forgotten, E." Louise froze, holding the photograph in her hands. Her heart began to pound, and she felt the blood rush to her face. It didn't feel like a friendly shot, it was something personal, something she didn't expect. James and Emily. She knew he was married, his wife, Linda, sometimes called the office, and he spoke fondly of her. But this photo, it screamed something else. She put the photo back, carefully covering it with papers, and sat down in the chair, feeling her thoughts swirl like autumn leaves. Emily and James. This explained a lot: her sarcastic jokes, her confidence, her views. But why then was there gossip about her, Louise? Why did Emily and Sarah point their fingers at her so persistently? The door opened and James returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Here, I took it for you," he said, placing one in front of her. "You're not a person without coffee." "Thank you," she muttered, taking the glass. Her voice was even, but everything was boiling inside. She looked at him, trying to find something in his face: guilt, a hint, but he was the same as always, open, slightly mocking. "Is something wrong?" he asked, sitting down at the table. "You look at me like I'm a ghost." "No, it's okay," she answered, looking away. "I was just thinking." He nodded without insisting, and they returned to work. But Louise was no longer listening. Her thoughts were busy with the photo, Emily, and what it could mean. As she left the office, her gaze fell on Emily, who was sitting at her desk, scrolling through her phone. She caught her eye and smiled, that same fake smile that Louise hated. And then it dawned on her. Gossip. Photo to Kelvin. Jokes about her and James. This was no accident. Emily, and maybe Sarah, was behind it. They weren't just jealous of her success. They distracted attention from themselves, from what was going on between them and James behind closed doors. Louise returned to her desk, her hands shaking with anger and realization. She opened the laptop, but could not work. Her mind was spinning this thought like an old record. She needed proof. She needed to understand how far this had gone. In the evening, when the office was empty, she stayed behind, pretending to finish her report. She waited until Emily and Sarah left. They were chatting by the elevator, laughing about something, and returned to James's office. The door was unlocked, and she walked in feeling like a thief. She picked up the papers again, found the photo, and put it in her jacket pocket. That wasn't all, she needed more. She opened his desk drawer, hoping to find something else, and came across an old phone chip without a password. She turned it on, and her heart stopped. The messages contained dozens of text messages from Emily, flirting, hints, plans for meetings, and one from Sarah. "Are you done with her yet?" She begins to suspect. James's answer, "Don't worry, I'll distract her." Louise turned off the phone, put it back, and left the office, feeling her legs give way. This was not just a romance, it was a game, and she was a pawn. But now she had a trump card, a small, crumpled photograph in her pocket, and she was going to use it. Louise stood at the coffee machine in the office, holding an empty mug, but was in no hurry to fill it. It was around noon on Tuesday. Louise put the mug on the table and pretended to be fiddling with the sugar when she heard familiar voices behind the partition. Emily and Sarah stood in the corner by the printer, their whispers barely audible, but she strained her ears, feeling her heart speed up. "Are you sure he won't say anything?" Sarah's voice was nervous. She was fiddling with the edge of her tablet, as she always did when she was worried. If Louise saw something. "Relax," Emily replied, her tone confident, almost mocking. "James knows what to do. He will distract her, as always. She's too busy with her projects to dig around." Louise froze. Her fingers squeezed the sugar packet so that it tore, and white grains fell onto the table. She quickly brushed them away, pretending not to hear anything, but her ears caught every word. "And her husband." Sarah lowered her voice, but Louise still understood. "Did you see how he left the corporate party? If he knows something." "He doesn't know anything," Emily interrupted her, and anger flashed in her voice. "I sent him this photo. From the number you gave me. He now thinks that she and James are playing tricks, and this is to our advantage. While they are sorting things out there, no one is looking at us." Louise felt her stomach tighten. She slowly turned around so she could see them out of the corner of her eye. Emily stood with her arms crossed, her brown hair shining under the lamps, and Sarah nervously adjusted her glasses, looking somewhere at the floor. "But if she finds out that it's us?" Sarah began, but Emily interrupted her. "She won't know," she snapped. "We did everything cleanly. James doesn't see her as a woman, he told me himself. She's just a workhorse for him. And he and I. Well, you know." Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you sure that he will be with you for a long time?" she asked quietly. "He's married, Em, and I saw how he spoke to you on Friday as if you were annoying him." Emily snorted, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "That's how he plays," she said, "so that no one suspects. But he's mine, and you're up to your neck in this too, so don't twitch. We're just keeping Louise on a leash until things calm down." Louise turned away, her breathing becoming uneven. She poured coffee into a mug, although her hands were shaking, and pretended to go to her desk. Her heart was pounding, and their words were spinning in her head. "I sent him a photo. It was Emily. It was she who destroyed her marriage, who gave Calvin that blurry evidence that tore their lives apart. And Sarah is her accomplice, her shadow, who helped weave this web." She sat down at the table, put down her mug, and opened her laptop, but her eyes couldn't see the screen. Everything worked out: gossip, photos, jokes. Her anger grew like wildfire, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. She needed more than words, she needed evidence that she could throw in their faces. Louise took out her phone and opened her notes, quickly typing. Emily sent the photo to Calvin. Sarah knows. She and James. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood up, heading towards James' office. She needed to check one more thing. James was sitting at the table, scrolling through something on the screen, when she entered. "Louise, you're on time," he said, smiling. "Sit down, I need to look at Dalton's draft." "Of course," she answered, sitting down. Her voice was even, but everything was boiling inside. She opened the laptop, but her gaze slid to the desk drawer where that old phone lay. She knew there were messages there, evidence that could confirm everything. They started working, and Louise deliberately stalled for time, asking unnecessary questions so that he would be distracted. As he reached for his coffee, she discreetly opened the drawer, pulled out her phone, and slipped it into her jacket pocket quickly before he noticed. "I need to go to the restroom," she said, standing up. "I'll be back soon." "Go ahead," he nodded, without looking up from the screen. She left the office, feeling the phone tugging at her pocket. In the hallway, she turned toward the break room, a small nook with a sofa and a microwave, where no one was there. After closing the door, she turned on her phone and opened her messages. There were dozens of text messages from Emily flirting, plans for meetings, even photos in lingerie, and a few from Sarah, short, businesslike, but with the same subtext. "Make sure she's busy. James, tell her this isn't about her." Louise clutched the phone, her nails digging into her palms. This was the proof that bound them all. Emily slept with James, Sarah helped, and they both set her up to create a distraction. She took screenshots, sent them to her email, and turned off the phone, feeling her arth strength is growing stronger. Returning to the office, she quietly put the phone back in the drawer while James was on the phone with a client. He didn't even notice her entering. "Is everything okay?" he asked after ending the call. "Yes," she answered, her voice cold but calm. "It's just a headache." "Rest, if anything," he said, and she nodded, leaving. On her desk, she opened her mail, looking at the screenshots. Emily had a photo with James in her pocket, and now she had messages. This was her arsenal, small but deadly. She knew what to do next. She didn't just need to expose them, she needed to destroy them so that they wouldn't rise again, and bring Calvin back if he still wanted to listen to her. At the end of the day, she stayed in the office, pretending to finish work. When everyone left, she sat in silence, looking at the screen where the screenshots were glowing. Louise turned off her phone and started the car, pulling out of the parking lot. She needed to go home, not to sleep, but to think. The road was wet, the headlights picked out puddles from the darkness, and she turned on the radio to drown out the silence. Fleetwood Mac's "Landslide" was playing, and her voice, husky, full of pain, resonated with what she was feeling. She didn't sing, but the words were spinning in her head. "Can I handle the seasons of my life? Will she be able to cope with this season of her life?" At home, she dropped her bag at the door and walked into the kitchen. There was still a bottle of wine in the refrigerator, the one she and Calvin had bought together, but she didn't bother opening it. Instead, she made tea black, strong as her determination, and sat down at the table with her laptop. The photo of Emily and James lay next to each other, its wrinkled edges a reminder of how long this lie had been hidden. She opened her email and downloaded the screenshots, creating a folder called Evidence. Then she took out a notepad and began to write in more detail. She needed to get to the office at night, maybe tomorrow, after everyone had left. She had the key to James's office. He'd given it to her a couple of months ago, when they were working on an urgent project until midnight. She could check his computer, his mailboxes, and find something else. Emily and Sarah could have been careless, leaving traces that she missed. Louise took a sip of tea, feeling the warmth spread down her throat. Her plan was risky. If she was caught, it could cost her her job. But she has already lost too much. Calvin, her faith in people, her pride. She wasn't going to lose the truth either. She remembered her and Calvin's first move, how they carried boxes under the scorching sun, how he laughed, throwing her books into the trunk. Then she thought they were invincible. Now she sat alone in the same house and planned revenge in order to return at least part of what was taken from her. Her eyes stung with tears, but she blinked them away, clenching her jaw. There was no time to cry. Next step, talk to someone who could help. James was out of the game, he was part of it, even if he didn't know about the gossip. But there was Margaret, the HR manager, an elderly woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She didn't like Emily, and Sarah Louise had heard her grumble about their idle chatter at the last meeting. By showing her the evidence, Margaret might be able to support her when she lays it all out on the table. Louise wrote, "Meeting with Margaret tomorrow morning." Then she got up and walked around the kitchen, feeling her nerves stretch like strings. She needed more something that would link Emily and Sarah directly to the photo sent to Calvin. She remembered their conversation. "From the number you gave me. This means Sarah had a burner number. If she finds him, it will be the final nail in their coffin." She returned to her laptop and opened the corporate network. She had access to shared files, including old reports from the sales department where Emily and Sarah worked. She started looking for anything, notes, correspondence, even a hint. An hour later, she came across a file, a contact list for last year's campaign. Among the numbers was one marked temporary, without a name, but with a date that coincided with when Calvin received the photo. She wrote it down, feeling her pulse quicken. Louise stood up and walked around the house, holding the phone in her hands. She dialed the number just to check. The beeps went on for a long time, and then the answering machine. "The number is temporarily unavailable." It was him. She knew it. Her lips stretched into a cold smile. For the first time in days, she felt like she was winning. She returned to the table, finished her tea, and opened the calendar. Tomorrow she will meet with Margaret, show her photos and screenshots, and tell her about the number. Then at night she will sneak into the office and find more evidence. She went to bed around midnight, leaving the kitchen light on, like a beacon for him to see if he returned. But he did not return, and she fell asleep with a plan in her head, preparing for war. Louise stood at the window of the 14th floor meeting room, looking out at the gray morning fog that shrouded Atlanta. It was 8 o'clock on Friday morning, and the office had not yet woken up. Only the occasional steps of employees echoed along the corridor. She was holding a folder with printed screenshots and photos of Emily and James in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. She stayed up most of the night, testing the plan she had made on Tuesday. Yesterday morning, she met with Margaret, the HR manager, in her small office on the 12th floor. Margaret, a gray-haired woman with a sharp gaze and an even sharper tongue, listened to her in silence, looking at the photos and screenshots through glasses that had slid down to the tip of her nose. When Louise had finished, Margaret leaned back in her chair and said, "This is serious, girl. If you're right, I'll support you. But be prepared, it's going to be a storm." Louise nodded, and Margaret gave her the green light for the meeting. On Wednesday night, she snuck into the office using James' office key. Her heart was pounding as she rummaged through his computer. She found another letter from Emily, sent from his personal email, where she thanked him for the night at the hotel and asked him to be careful with Linda, his wife. Louise printed it out, adding it to her arsenal. Now she had everything: photos, screenshots, a letter, a burner number that connected Sarah with sending the photo to Calvin. It was her sword, and she was going to cut it with it. The conference room door opened, and Margaret walked in, carrying a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. "Are you ready?" she asked. Her voice was dry, but there was support in it. "Meeting at 9. Everyone will." "Ready," Louise replied, turning to her. Her voice was firm, although she was still shaking inside. "Thank you for your support." "Don't thank me," Margaret waved her hand. "I can't stand these two chickens for a long time. If you're right, they'll be out of here faster than they can make a sound." Louise nodded, feeling her resolve strengthen. She donned a black suit, the same one she wore at the meeting with Delta, as armor. Today, she is not just a manager, but a warrior going to battle. By 9 o'clock, the meeting room was full. Employees sat around a long table, chatting and scrolling through their phones, a typical Friday meeting to discuss the results of the week. James was the last to enter, carrying his usual glass of coffee, and sat at the head of the table, throwing her a smile. "Well, shall we start?" he said, clapping his hands. "Louise, do you have any news on Delta?" Everyone turned to her, and she stood up, holding the folder in her hands. Her heart began to pound, but she took a deep breath, feeling the anger and pain of the last few days turn into strength. "Yes, there is news," she began, her voice even and loud. "But first I want to talk about something else." about what happens in this office behind closed doors. Silence fell over the room like a curtain. James frowned. Emily and Sarah, sitting in the corner, looked at each other, their faces tense. Louise opened the folder and took out a photo, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is Emily Jenkins and James Wilson," she said, her voice cutting the air like a knife. "Taken in the restaurant, according to the caption on the back, on a night Emily called unforgettable. This is not a friendly shot, and we all understand that." A whisper passed through the room. Someone coughed. Emily turned pale, her hand clutching the phone, and James opened his mouth. But before he could say anything, Louise continued. "I have messages." She took out printouts of screenshots and laid them out on the table. "Here is Emily's correspondence with James. Flirting, meeting, even mentioning his wife, Linda. And here is a letter where she thanks him for the night at the hotel. These are not rumors. These are the facts." Emily jumped up, her voice breaking into a squeal. "This is a lie. She made it all up. James, tell them." But James remained silent, his face turning red and his eyes darting around the room. Louise looked at Sarah, who sat slumped in her chair, her glasses quivering on her nose. "And this is for you, Sarah," said Louise, throwing a sheet of paper with a number on the table. "Burner is the number you gave Emily. From it, they sent my husband a photo of me and James an innocent moment that you turned into a lie. You both spread gossip about me to hide your affairs. And it worked. My marriage is ruined. But now it's your turn." The whisper turned into a rumble. Someone laughed. Someone gasped. Emily stepped towards her, her face contorted with rage. "You can't prove it," she shouted. "It's a fake copy. You're just jealous." "Am I jealous?" Louise laughed, coldly and sharply. "To what? Your lies? Your affair with a married man? I have the originals in the mail, Emily. Do you want me to send them to everyone right now?" Emily froze, her lips trembling. Sarah clutched the tablet, her eyes filling with tears. "We didn't mean to," she began, but Louise cut her off. "You didn't want to." Her voice became louder. "You set me up to cover yourself. You ruined my life because it was convenient for you. But now everyone knows who you are." James finally stood up, his voice hoarse. "Louise, that's enough," he said. "This is not the place." "Not the place?" She turned to him, her eyes burning. "You slept with her, James. And with Sarah, judging by the messages. You knew what they were doing and remained silent. You're just as guilty as they are." Margaret stood up, her voice rising above the noise. "That's enough," she said, her tone steely. "Louise, you said everything. James, Emily, Sarah to my office. Now, the rest are free." The employees began to stand up, whispering and exchanging glances. Emily gave Louise a look of hatred, but followed Margaret. Sarah followed, her shoulders shaking. James paused, looking at Louise. "You don't understand what you've done," he said quietly. "I understand," she replied, her voice cold. "I took off my masks. Go, James. Your wife will soon find out." He left, and Louise was left alone in the meeting room. She sat up, feeling her legs give way. Her heart was pounding, but inside she was empty not triumph, but weariness. She did it. She exposed them. But Calvin still had not returned, and this victory seemed bitter. She took out her phone and texted him. "I never cheated on you. I found out everything. This is Emily and Sarah. Come home if you want to talk." She sent the text and closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the office fade away outside the door. Louise sat on the sofa in her living room, staring at the blank TV screen that she never turned on. It was about 7 on a Friday evening, and dusk was gathering outside the windows, painting the Atlanta suburbs in soft gray and blue tones. On the coffee table in front of her was a cup of cold tea and her phone, which still glowed with a sent message to Calvin. She sent it in the morning after the meeting, but there was no response. The silence from him was like a knife that was slowly piercing her chest, and she didn't know how long she could bear it. The day passed in a blur. After she laid all her cards on the table at the meeting, the office erupted with whispers and stares. Emily, Sarah, and James went with Margaret to her office, and were never seen again. Rumors had already spread that they would be fired, or at least suspended. Louise stayed until the end of the working day, finishing the report, but her hands were shaking, and her thoughts revolved around one thing. She won, but at what cost? Calvin was still out there somewhere, out of her reach, and this victory seemed empty without him. She stood up and walked around the room, feeling how the wooden floor was cold on her bare feet. Her gaze fell on the photo on the shelf of her and Calvin. Now it seemed like someone else's life. She turned away, clenched her fists, and returned to the couch. Her revenge was not over. Emily and Sarah had destroyed her marriage, and she was going to hit them where it hurt the most, their own families. Louise took the laptop from the kitchen table and opened it. The evidence folder contained all the evidence. She knew that Emily was married to Mike Jenkins, a simple worker who repaired trucks at a service station on the outskirts of the city. Sarah was the wife of Tom Miller, a high school teacher and quiet guy with a reputation as an exemplary family man. Louise found their contacts on Wednesday, digging through the corporate database email addresses they provided for family events. She opened her mail and created a new letter, attaching all the files. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and she closed her eyes, feeling her heart pounding. This was the final step to send the truth to their husbands so that they would know who their wives were. She felt no pity. Emily and Sarah didn't feel sorry for her when they set her up in front of Calvin. But it was more than revenge, it was justice. Louise began to write. Mike, Tom. I'm Louise Harper, a colleague of your wives. This is hard to read, but you need to know the truth. Emily and Sarah cheated on you with our boss, James Wilson. Here is the evidence, photos, messages, everything I found. They also spread gossip about me to hide their affairs, and this ruined my marriage. I don't want you to be left in the dark like I was. Decide for yourself what to do with it. Louisa. She reread the text, her breathing uneven. It was short, straightforward, without unnecessary emotions like a hammer blow. She added Mike and Tom's addresses as recipients, attached the files, and clicked send. The screen flickered, the letter went away, and she leaned back on the couch, feeling her hands shake. Half an hour later, her phone vibrated an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. She answered the phone, her voice hoarse. Hello? This is Mike Jenkins. The voice on the other end was low, rough, with a slight tremble. Are you the one who sent me this? About Emily? Louise swallowed, her heart pounding. Yes, it's me, she answered. I'm sorry you had to see this, but I... Don't apologize, he snapped, his tone becoming harsher. I knew she was up to something, but this... Damn, this proves everything. Thank you for saying that. She won't be coming home today. He hung up the call without letting her answer. Louise stared at the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and heaviness. 10 minutes later, another message arrived, a text message from a different number. This is Tom Miller. I received your letter. I don't know what to say other than thank you. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Good luck. She placed the phone on the table, her hands falling to her knees. Everything was done. She expected triumph, but instead of it came fatigue, a deep, bone-breaking fatigue. She destroyed them as they destroyed her, but it didn't bring Calvin back. Louise stood up, poured herself some water from the tap, and drank it in one gulp, feeling the cold running down her throat. She went into the bedroom, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Her thoughts revolved around Calvin, where he was, what he was doing if he had seen her message. She wanted him to come, for them to talk, so that he would trust her. But he didn't come. The next morning, she was awakened by the doorbell. She jumped up, her heart leaping. Calvin. She ran to the door in her pajamas, opened it, but there was a courier standing there with a package. Louise Harper? He asked, holding out the box. Yes, she answered, her voice weak with disappointment. This is for you, he said and left. She closed the door, looking at the package small, without a return address. Inside was an envelope with a note. Thank you for the truth. This is from Mike. And a wad of money, $500 wrapped in an elastic band. Louise threw the envelope on the table, feeling her cheeks heat up. She didn't want money, she wanted justice, and she got it. but Calvin was still a shadow, eluding her. By Saturday evening, she was sitting in the kitchen, looking at her phone. She dialed his number, but stopped short of pressing the call. Instead, she wrote another SMS. I proved everything. They are to blame, not me. Please talk to me. I sent it and waited, but the screen remained dark. Emily and Sarah lost everything: their husbands, their jobs, their reputations. James, most likely, too. Margaret promised to transfer his case higher. But Louise did not feel joy. She sat in an empty house, listening to the silence, and realized that her victory was only half. The other half depended on Calvin, and she didn't know if he would ever return. And then she heard a sound, the low hum of a motor, as familiar as her own breathing. She jumped up, her heart leaping, and ran to the window. The Dodge Ram's headlights illuminated the yard, and the car stopped in front of the house. The truck door opened, and Calvin stepped out, tall, wearing a dark sweatshirt, with disheveled hair and a tired face. He stood under the lantern, looking at the house, and Louise felt her breath stop. She rushed to the door, opened it, and froze on the threshold. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't notice her eyes were glued to it. Calvin looked up, and their eyes met across the yard. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, stubble, hunched shoulders, but there was something new in his gaze. Not anger, not doubt, but something soft, almost broken. "Lou," he said. His voice was hoarse and quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Calvin," she breathed, stepping forward. Her legs were shaking, but she stopped, not knowing what to do next. "Did you receive my SMS?" "Yes," he nodded, putting his hands in the pockets of his sweatshirt. "Both. I wanted to come earlier, but I didn't know what to say." She swallowed, feeling the lump in her throat growing. "Why didn't you answer?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was waiting for you, Kel. Every day." He lowered his head, rubbing his neck, an old habit when he was nervous. "I was a fool, Lou," he said finally, looking up. "I saw your message this morning about Emily and Sarah, but damn, I didn't know how to look you in the eyes after everything." Louise stepped towards him. Her bare feet touched the wet grass, but she did not feel the cold. "You didn't believe me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was pain in it. "You were following me, Calvin. You left because you believed them and not me." He nodded, his face scrunched up as if her words had hit him. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I believed this photo, this gossip. Brian, Trevor, they kept adding, and I listened. But yesterday I was sitting in the car, drinking beer and thinking about you, about the way you looked at me at the corporate party, and I realized that I screwed up." Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with her sleeve, feeling anger and love fighting inside her. "Why didn't you come right away?" she asked. "I proved everything, Kel. This is them, Emily and Sarah. They sent you that photo to separate us. I exposed them in front of everyone. But you left me alone." Calvin stepped towards her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a couple of feet away, looking at her, his eyes sparkling with tears he was trying to hold back. "I was afraid, Lou," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was afraid that you wouldn't forgive me, that I've gone too far. I sat at Jack's, drank, thought. And yesterday, when you wrote for the second time, I couldn't hide anymore. I should have seen you." She looked at him, feeling her heart break. She wanted to scream, to hit him, but most of all, she wanted to hold him, to bring him home, to bring their life back. "You destroyed me, Calvin," she said, her voice shaking. "You left when you needed me most. But I never cheated, never." He nodded, stepping closer, and his hand reached out to her, but stopped. "I know," he said. "I saw this in your text messages, and I hated myself for not believing you right away. I'm sorry, Lou. Please." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands, and he couldn't resist. He stepped towards her, hugged her, pulling her towards him. His sweatshirt was cold and damp from the air, but his warmth penetrated through it, and Louise buried herself in his chest, feeling the tears flow freely. He hugged her tightly, his hand stroked her hair, and she heard him whisper, "I love you, Lou. I'm such an idiot. Sorry." She pulled away, looking up at him, her eyes red but clear. "I love you too," she said, her voice weak but firm. "But we need to fix this, Kel. I can't live with this mistrust." He nodded, his hand squeezing her shoulder. "I want to fix it," he said. "Whatever you say. I won't listen to anyone but you anymore." Louise wiped away her tears, feeling her breathing even out. "We need a psychologist," she finally said. "Someone who can help us figure it out. I want to trust you again, but I need time." "Okay," he nodded, his voice firm. "Psychologist. Anything. I won't leave again, Lou. I promise." She looked at him, feeling his words sink in. It wasn't an instant healing. The rift between them was deep and couldn't be healed overnight. But it was a step, a small, fragile step towards getting their lives back. "Let's go home," she said quietly, taking his hand. Cold. He nodded, and they entered the house together. Calvin took off his shoes at the door, threw the keys on the table, and they sat on the sofa, still holding hands. The silence was soft, not heavy, and Louise felt her body relax for the first time in a week. "Tell me," he said, looking at her. "Everything you did. I want to know." She nodded and began. He squeezed her hand, his gaze softening. "You are stronger than I thought," he said. "I'm proud of you, Lou." She smiled weakly but sincerely and snuggled closer to him. They sat for a long time until the clock struck midnight, and Louise realized that this was the beginning. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.